Well, thanks very much, Dorothy, for reading that to us. There's a little taster from last week's passage and then into this week's passage as well. I was trying to think of how to describe what I hope we're going to see and sort of look at this morning. And it's for some reason, a scene from Formula One motor racing came to mind, just to try and give you a bit of a sense of where we're going this morning. Obviously, a Formula One Grand Prix team there are many people on that team. In fact, somebody from our youth group years ago used to work for one of the teams. I can't remember which one now. But there's a vast army of people obviously trying to get this car that can go as fast as possible and sort of do all the corners and everything else, so many technicians, mechanics and all that working on that. Then, of course, as you get to a Formula One race, you've got those that come with the team. You've got those, you often see them with their ear sort of defenders on, looking at multiple screens, sort of monitoring what the car's doing during the race. You've got the driver and so on. And then, of course, every race moves to a different circuit. And so you've got the owners of that circuit, those involved in making the race happen, helping everybody to stay safe and all that sort of thing. And I think probably these people are absolutely drilled, aren't they, in what to do in any given situation. So something very straightforward, more straightforward, like tyres that need changing. If you've ever seen that, they zip into the pits and within 2 point whatever seconds, the tyres off, a new one's on and they've gone. They're just absolutely like machines. But I think also everybody is probably absolutely drilled in terms of what they're to do, in terms of procedures, if something much bigger goes wrong. So often you'll see a crash, debris all over the track, and you'll see immediately people know exactly what they're to do. The stewards, the safety people all around, the teams, everybody it's almost don't need to think, they just do it. Sometimes in Formula One you have a terrible situation, don't you? Sometimes you actually see a car clip another one and take off and fly, hit the fence, hit tyres. A car can overturn, a fire can happen. But I think, again, as awful as that is, everybody is drilled. Everybody would know exactly what they're to do, what their role is in that terrible situation. Now, what we're going to see in this passage this morning is, as God's people, what do we do when things go terribly wrong? Or we're suddenly faced with something that our brain is almost frazzled by. We don't know what to make of it. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to deal with it. What do we do? How can we be equipped? And I think something of this passage, and we'll see in the next couple of weeks as well, little bits of help in that. But I think that's what we're going to see, the main thrust of this morning. How does this passage, how does Habakkuk equip us when something like that happens in our life? We met Habakkuk last week, verses 1 to 11 of chapter 1. He was a troubled man, troubled by God's apparent inactivity in the face of violence, injustice, wrong, strife, conflict. These sort of things have become a way of life in Judah among God's people. And the heart of Habakkuk's sort of troubles is there in verse 2, where he says, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out violence, Hamas, but you do not save?" And in verse 5, we saw God assure Habakkuk that he was indeed about to act. But his actions were going to be totally unexpected. Do you remember that sort of repeated phrase, be made amazed, be made amazed? What God is going to do is utterly shocking. And if Habakkuk had been hoping for days of revival or a new king and a return of the people to God and a changed lifestyle, those hopes were completely dashed. Verse 6 would have been an enormous shock. The sort of news he would never have believed, verse 6, when God said, "I am raising up the Babylonians." God was coming in judgment against his covenant people. And as we're sort of following Habakkuk through this very short book of 3 chapters, his burden of verses 1 and 2 of chapter 1 has now got a whole lot bigger. We said, didn't we, last week, that this book is very much like an ancient form of question time. Habakkuk asked his first question, God responded. We saw that last week. Habakkuk is now going to come back with the second question. That's where we are this week. A Babylonian invasion spells utter disaster for Judah. I want you to try and just imagine this a little bit. Try and feel what's going to happen here. This invasion is utter disaster. The Babylonians are totally ruthless. Somebody said to me in the week, in terms of growth group notes, they said, just put a note down and ask people to Google the Babylonians, to get a glimpse of what this actually meant, what they were like. Verse 6 says in chapter 1 that they are ruthless, that they have seized the dwelling places of others. The old Assyrian Empire has been overthrown. The Egyptians have been overthrown. And as a result, verse 7, they are a ruthless war machine. They are a feared and dreaded people. Everybody knew about them and feared them and dreaded them. And I think if you're struggling to get into Habakkuk's shoes a little bit in this book that he's written, I want you to think, how would you feel if you heard God say, I am raising up Al-Qaeda. I am raising up thousands upon thousands of sort of terrorists with their plots and their plans. Or I am raising up a new version, a new incarnation, if you like, of the Nazi Party. When you look at the brutality and the suffering inflicted by the Babylonians, the comparison is not overly out of sync. I wonder if that thought troubles you. Could God actually ever say that? Could God ever actually do something like that? Well, welcome to Habakkuk's burden. If God could raise up people like that, and you knew your country, our country, was next on their list, they were heading this way, you knew the history, you'd seen the ruthless brutality of the nations that they've conquered before you, and they're now coming for you, for me, for our nation. Then add on to that we are, as Habakkuk is, a member of God's covenant people. And you see how that burden just multiplies. Now, as I said, one of the most helpful things that we have in this passage this morning is how a man of faith, Habakkuk, deals with this extremely difficult, confusing circumstance where doubt and questioning, in a sense, of course, abound. It sort of makes sense that we would struggle, knowing what we know of God, that we would struggle to understand this. And I think as Christians living in a fallen world, in a world that's shaken its fist at God, told God they don't want him, want to do things our own way, where everything is affected because of that rebellion and turning, we are going, aren't we, to come across places in our lives where there is this apparent contradiction and conflict between what we know about God and yet what our eyes are seeing. I don't know if any here, either this morning or watching, have been watching any of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. It's a sort of the latest Marvel comic sort of thing to come to the television. A couple of the Avengers, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And there's a scene in this series, I won't say too much just in case you're watching it or you haven't seen it all, but there's a scene here in the thing where Captain America, who has, I don't know exactly what happened to him. I think he's gone into like an Avengers retirement village or something. But he sort of stepped down from the role, and there's a new Captain America on the scene. And I won't give any of the details away, but there's a moment where something happens and there's a crowd of people around Captain America, and one by one phones are coming out to video what's happening, photographing what's happening. And on the faces of everyone, there's a look of utter disbelief in what they are seeing Captain America doing. They know something about this figure's history, his heroic actions. They know something about the character that they've come to expect of Captain America. But what they are seeing before their eyes brings utter confusion and disbelief. And I think the thing that Habakkuk is doing for us is it's speaking, isn't it, into those moments where we are caused to question things that are happening. Why are they happening? What is God doing? We're searching deeply. It may be world events. It may be a dreadful pandemic and looking at the impact and the effects of that. It may be seeing a war or something, maybe on the news and the effects of that, or famine. It may come closer to home. It may be broken relationships or loss or bereavement or personal illness or loss of job or something that's happening in your life. that you're questioning and wrestling with? Where do we go in those moments? How do we handle them? What do we do? Well, Habakkuk, I think, gives us at least a good start on some of this. There are 3 stages from verse 12 down to 2 verse 1, 3 stages that Habakkuk seems to move through. And I think in this he's a great model to help us to begin to think about this. So firstly, you notice in verses 12 and 13, Habakkuk affirms what he knows to be true about God. That's stage 1. Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you, or it could be, if you look at the footnote, it could be, we will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. I think it's really important, and it's helpful, I think, for me and I hope for us, to notice that Habakkuk doesn't simply launch into his questioning immediately. He starts by reminding himself what he knows to be true about God. And I think that's important because he's basically going to examine the uncertainties of life in light of the certainties of faith. Say that again, he's going to examine, and he is going to examine the uncertainties of life, the things going on that he doesn't understand, in light of the certainties of faith. When trouble hits, Habakkuk starts by affirming what he knows. Habakkuk turns his eyes to the fact immediately in verse 12 that God is the covenant God, Lord, capital letters, the covenant God of Israel, the everlasting covenant God. That's where he starts. His statement echoes one of Moses, where Moses says in Deuteronomy 33, the eternal God, the everlasting God, is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. There's plenty of that sense in these first 2 verses. He speaks of my God. Yes, the everlasting covenant God, but he's my God in these verses, my Holy One, my rock. And that indicates and tells us, doesn't it, that for both Habakkuk and Israel, they are in relationship with this God. It's not that they're cut off from him trying to figure out what's going on. He says, no, you are the covenant God. You've made promises to your people that you're in relationship with. You are the Lord, the everlasting God, my Holy One, my rock. Yes, verse 12, Habakkuk acknowledges that God has appointed the Babylonians. He's ordained them. They are his vehicle of judgment, but we will not die. I was pondering this as I was walking down this morning. Actually, whether it's we or you, that the implication of that is exactly the same. We will not die, says Habakkuk. This is about the faithfulness of God. You are everlasting. You will not die. You are the covenant God. You've made promises. You never change. You will never break them. And therefore we will not die. A king will be enthroned on David's throne forever. You keep your promises. A son of David will be your chosen everlasting king over an everlasting kingdom. The promises to Abraham that through him, through his seed, blessing would come to the whole world. God is bound to those promises. He's bound to Israel. And the Babylonians, whatever their might, whatever their ruthlessness, however they are feared, they cannot and will not snuff out God's promises to Israel altogether. We will not die. So you see, when this calamitous situation is coming over the hill towards Habakkuk and Israel, he begins by rehearsing God is everlasting. God is a God of faithfulness. God is a God who keeps his promises. God is the sovereign ruler of history who appoints and uses whom he chooses. He's all-powerful. He reigns even in this sinful and fallen world. Nothing is out of his control. Nothing catches him out. And even evil and wrong can be used by him to accomplish his purposes. All of that in just a couple of verses, Habakkuk is rehearsing, saying to God, reminding himself. And in verse 13, he speaks of God's eyes being too pure to look on evil, the purity of God, the holiness of God, the God who cannot tolerate wrongdoing. And it's that then leaves Habakkuk into phase 2. It's that truth about God, that he's too pure to look on evil, he cannot tolerate wrongdoing, that leads him into his next sort of part of the process. Having stated the solid ground, Habakkuk now honestly brings his questions to God. The sense of this is, given your purity, We know you are pure. We know you're a God of extreme holiness. Given the fact that you cannot tolerate wrong, why then are you tolerating wrong? Is Habakkuk's question. How can you not only tolerate these dreadful Babylonians, verse 13, tolerating the treacherous, I think the Babylonians are in view there. How can you not only tolerate that, but use that wicked people to bring your judgment and disciplining hand against Israel, who are bad, but not on the scale of badness, if you like, of these Babylonians? That's the sort of heartbeat of his question. And from verse 14 onwards, he gives evidence to support what he's saying about these Babylonians. He says, verse 14, you have made people like fish in the sea, like sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. It's as if this Babylonian war machine is now like a kind of an armoured fishing trawler going across the seas, gathering up the people in the net, catching them in his dragnet. He rejoices and is glad as he goes, chinking the glasses of beer, rejoicing as people and nations are caught up in their dragnet. They sacrifice to the dragnet. They burn incense to his dragnet. By this net, he's living in luxury, wiping through nation after nation, destroying people after people, living it up with the spoils of war, living in luxury, enjoying the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? His strength, verse 11, is his God. These people idolize themselves and their strength. They sacrifice to themselves. They're proud of themselves as they destroy villages and towns and treat people abominably. They rejoice. How then, God, says Habakkuk, can you use this people to judge Israel, to judge those actually more righteous than themselves? I think in terms of the book here, Habakkuk has, to some extent, I think, accepted that God is disciplining Israel. You remember his complaint back in verse 4. Justice never prevails. Where are you? Why are you doing nothing? Well, he now knows, doesn't he, verse 12, that God is executing judgment. God is dealing with that injustice and wrong and violence. His judgment is coming. But Habakkuk's problem now is the means of that judgment. So he begins by affirming what he knows to be true about God. He goes to God with his problem. He's honest, isn't he, here? Absolutely honest with God. I don't think coming at it, so, I'm more righteous than you, I need to inform you where you've gone wrong. But there's a rawness here, there's an honesty, there's an openness before God, a laying bare of his concerns and his confusion. And then thirdly, the man of faith waits. He waits. I don't know if anyone in the building has any particular memories of school trips, maybe at home as well. Where have you been on your school trips? Anton, have you been anywhere with the school that you've enjoyed, a school trip on a coach or anything?
I went to Fellowship and Float for a week. That was quite nice.
Okay.
We also went to the National Space Museum in Leicester.
Oh, wow. Brilliant. So a week on the water and a week at the sort of space museum. We lived on the near the south coast, near the beach. So a lot of our trips, we went to a submarine museum. Got some good stories from there if you want to chat afterwards. But we would go to castles and forts and, draw a picture of the different parts of the sort of castle or the fort, and the ramparts and this, that and the other, and label them up in diagrams and all that. Anyway, had a good look around. Habakkuk takes us to one of those scenes actually in chapter 2 verse 1. This is where this section kind of ends, this waiting on the Lord, this third sort of and final part really to his approach. He says in chapter 2 verse 1, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am going to give to this complaint. He ends with this picture of the soldier on sort of sentry duty, stationed at his watch. The ramparts there on the top of the city wall, the sort of lookout post, a defensive sort of position where they can look into the distance and see what's coming. And that's where Habakkuk takes himself at the end of this process. He takes up the position now of waiting and looking to the Lord. He knows that the only answer to this can actually come from the Lord. I think we see in Job, don't we? Job and his friends sort of knocking around the issues, the problems, trying to seek wisdom from one another, which just doesn't work in Job. Habakkuk knows Job came to realise that the only answer can ever come from the Lord, the one who knows all things, the one who's above all things. And so Habakkuk raises his mind at the end above what he sees, the situation that makes no sense, that sort of Captain America scene in the film that just doesn't make sense what's happening there. He rises, in a sense, above that, above the confusion, and in vigilance, he looks to the Lord for his answer. He looks to see what God will say to him, and he waits. The man of faith, the woman of faith, waits on the Lord. And so I think we've come full circle. You know, I don't know what's happening in everybody's lives. I know some, and I know some things are very, very tough. And as we grapple, we have, I think, a little bit of a help here with Habakkuk. It's not the full and final answer, but it's a bit of a help, isn't it, I think? Rehearse what you know to be true about God. Affirm what you know to be true. You might need his help to do that, actually. To rehearse what you know, what is solid, what is concrete. What do you know about God's character? What do you know about him? Everlasting, the promise maker. The one who says, I will never leave you, never forsake you. The one who's spoken about the future he has prepared for you. There might be all sorts of things we need to rehearse. Start there. Start with what's sure. Start with what's certain. And take the issue to God. We need both, don't we? Not just one or not the other. We need both. Take the issue to God. Be honest with him. State your concerns. State your questions. State your confusion. Wrestle with him. And then wait on him. Station yourself deliberately on the ramparts. Wait in faith. And this waiting isn't passive, is it? He's there saying in chapter 2, verse 1, I will look to see what he will say to me. So I think here and now in our situation, the man or woman of faith will wait prayerfully, openly, seeking the Lord and waiting in his word. What does he say? What more wisdom can I glean? How might the Spirit lead me to truths that God has revealed? And sometimes that's helpful to do with somebody else. It's nice, isn't it? I mean, I can go and talk to Jenny and Isaac and they might give me some good advice and wisdom, but to sit with them and to search God's word, for them to point me to God's word, to stand with me and to pray. And God has given us this family as a body to strengthen one another. So I think that's the kind of main thing that this passage brings us. When the Formula One car hits three others and they fly into the sky and spin and debris flying off and fire comes, well, people go into automatic pilot. They know what to do. And that's a bit clinical and clear, isn't it? Life's messy. But I think this is a help to us, isn't it? Rehearse what you know to be true. Take it to the Lord. Wrestle with him. Be honest with him. Do business with him. And wait on him. Look for his word. Look for what he will say. Well, next week we will get to answer 2, to question 2. Chapter 2 will be God's answer to the issues that Habakkuk's raised. So we'll get to that next week.